Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of TADA Talks. I'm Todd Phillips, not Todd Bourgon, and I'll be the guest host of this episode. I'm the editor of Canadian Auto Dealer and the vice president of Universus. Today's podcast is sponsored by TRADER Corporation, and joining us today is Baris Akyurek, the Director of Marketing Intelligence at TRADER Corporation. And so, Baris, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Todd. I appreciate it.
Well, tell us a bit about yourself and your role at TRADER before we dive in here.
Of course, I started at TRADER quite a while ago, back in 2014. And when I joined, my mandate was to build the analytics team. So I don't want to get into too much detail, but we've done that. So now I oversee the analytics team. And in addition to that, obviously, we do a lot of research, a lot of analytics. We look at a lot of data to understand what's happening in the market. So my role is now to combine all the information from these different sources so that we have a better understanding, good understanding of what's happening in the market.
Well, I know dealers like data. They particularly like to find out about consumers and buying trends and habits, that sort of thing. We're going to get into specific topics around the microchip shortage and consumer behavior in a second. But overall, the dealers also always want to hear about, can you give us some perspective on the used car market in general now, and where do you think it's heading?
Yeah, so the market has been very different, to say the least in the last year and a half. So going back to the beginning of the pandemic, obviously there was a bit of a decline in demand. And then come the beginning of the summer of last year, we saw that our marketplace traffic increased by quite a bit. So we wanted to understand what's happening. We wanted to understand the why behind it. And we did a couple of research studies. And what we found out was that consumers were interested in buying cars because they didn't feel as safe as they used to in public transportation and ride-sharing services. So we believe that this created a quote-unquote new demand in the market. And throughout the year, obviously, we kept looking at data, doing research and analysis. And beginning of this year, again, going through the macro data, what we figured out was that this has come up in the media quite a few times, and we presented it at different forums as well, is that there is a very dramatic increase in household savings rate. So looking back 25 years, the household savings rate used to sit around like 2.8% historically, and when the pandemic hit, this went up to 28%. So it's a big jump. Well, kind of like reasons are kind of obvious, like there's no vacations, there's no big expenses and all that stuff. So Canadians were able to save quite a bit of money. So what we did was we got this information from the market, and we ran our own research study and asked vehicle intenders, those consumers who are intending to buy a vehicle in the next 6 months, to see if they were able to save money. And half of them said that they did. And 64% of consumers said that they were going to use this additional, quote unquote, additional money to purchase a vehicle. So we believe the combination of these two factors created this new demand in the market. That's what we are seeing. And additionally, obviously, with the restrictions and lockdowns and whatnot, there's some pent-up demand, right? One of the big banks did this study, and they noticed that whenever there's a lockdown or whenever there's a restriction, the consumer spending goes down, and when it opens up, things go back up. So now that things are slowly opening up, and hopefully it'll stay that way, this is what we believe is happening in the market right now.
Okay. Did this lead to an increase in either website traffic for your own properties and also listings, that more people were listing used vehicles and searching for them?
Yeah, so as I said, after the initial shock, I guess, for lack of a better term, The traffic increased by quite a bit beginning of last summer, and it stayed pretty consistent since then. So searches are up, people are looking at vehicles, and things have been pretty consistent since then.
Well, this also dovetails into our next topic, which is really the microchip shortage, because a lot of consumers are interested in buying even new vehicles or struggling maybe to get the exact model they want because of inventory constraints. I know it's a big issue most dealers are aware of, but you did some research recently where you surveyed consumers to get their sense of, were they aware of this issue and that sort of thing. So maybe tell us a bit about that study, what drove the reason for that study, maybe some of the findings.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think pretty much everybody's aware, and this is confirmed in our research as well. A lot of people get to hear about the ongoing inventory shortages in the market. So that's no big news. And, the impact is kind of like from the dealer's perspective, less cars, and like there are some obvious ramifications of this. But one thing that we didn't really see in the market is that what's the perception of the consumer? What do they, first of all, are they aware? If they're aware, are they actually changing their habits, their behavior, or are they making any changes to how they purchase cars? So what we did was end of May, beginning of June, we ran this study on the site, and then we asked Canadians whether they were aware, and 90% of the consumers said that they were aware of what the ongoing microchip shortages, and 80% said that they're in fact expecting some sort of a impact on the automotive market as well. So people are aware, but on the other hand, I think the more important insight is that they're changing their behavior based on what's going on. So they're expecting higher prices, they're expecting less incentives, less negotiation in the market. But on the other hand, they're preparing to spend more on the cars that they're intending to buy. So 28% of the new car shoppers said that they're willing to pay more, and 11% of used car shoppers said that they're willing to pay more. So these are high-level findings from the research, but I can, throughout the conversation, I can definitely dig deeper and tell a little bit more about it.
Sure. One thing that's interesting is, what does this mean sort of at the dealership level? Does this mean obviously they can hold firm on their pricing? They don't need to really enter into negotiations if the consumer mindset is already there that that inventory is tight. So I mean, how do you think this type of information, this type of mood or sentiment, if you will, among auto intenders impacts the way dealers should be conducting their business, at least in the short term, till the supply improves?
So, good question. Before I answer your question directly, let me tell you a little bit about the pricing side of things. So we have lots of cars on the side, just over 450,000 cars, and we have all the data associated with it. So we've been crunching data on a real-time basis to understand what's happening with the market as it pertains to pricing on an ongoing basis. So what we are seeing is that, but I'm talking about the July data, last month's data. The used car prices are up by 12.8%, and the average price of a car is $28,800. Okay, and when I looked at it right before this call to see where things are for August, and the trend seems to be continuing. And so we're around 14.8% on a year-over-year basis. So prices have been going up, that is true. But going back to your question, I think you asked about how dealers can adapt. So one of the things that we found during the research is that more and more consumers are interested in comparison shopping, and we see that on our website traffic as well. A lot of our consumers they want to compare cars, and they want to know whether the car that they're interested in, how does it fare with the overall market price. So we have capabilities and tools where you can just click on an ad, and then you'll see if the vehicle is great price, good price, fair price, or above average. So consumers are taking advantage of these features. On the going to the second thing, one of the other interesting findings from the research was that consumers are willing to travel much more than they used to. So 30% of the consumers surveyed that stated that they're willing to travel an additional 400 kilometers to find the vehicle they want to find. So if you think about it, right, 400 kilometers, it's a lot of driving. But if there's less cars in the market, and if you're looking for a specific brand, make, model, whatever, consumers are willing to travel, and they do their research, as I said, through comparison tools and transparency tools. So I think from dealers' perspective, understanding these dynamics is super important. And when the consumer shows up at your lot, probably it would be good to expect them to be more knowledgeable. Because of the situation, they've done their research, they know the price is better, they know what's happening in the market, and they're ready to go ahead. So these are the couple of things that came out from the research that might be helpful for our dealers.
Well, what's interesting too for dealers, if consumers are willing to drive that much farther, it really changes the idea of who is in your market area. I mean, I know dealers are restricted in where they can advertise, but they should maybe expect, if they're really merchandising their used vehicles well and there's a short supply, somebody's willing to drive that far. They're not necessarily all coming from your community, and maybe their own outreach and their own approach to sort of accepting the fact. I mean, 400 kilometers, many dealers wouldn't think that would be a typical buyer.
Yes, definitely. That's a great point. I mean, there are some limitations as to how they can market their cars, especially the franchise dealers on the new car side, but used car is obviously a little bit more flexible. That's definitely a great point. Things have been really interesting, and consumer behavior is definitely changing according to the research that we've done.
And I know this might be outside of your sweet spot, but is there any advice you could give for dealers in terms of really effectively merchandising their vehicles when they do put a listing together? Because you're mentioning it's a very competitive landscape where they're going to be doing comparison shopping, and does that include putting the dealership name, contact info on the vehicle images, making sure they're well merchandised? What works in terms of really standing out from the crowd in terms of a dealer getting some of that traffic?
I think the usual suspects still apply. Having good multiple pictures of the vehicle, and the description of the car, the condition, and how it is, and whether it's been in an accident, the Carfax reports and whatnot. Providing as much detail as possible is always good. And the other thing is that obviously, as I mentioned, consumers are doing more and more research. They're doing comparison shopping, trying to understand the market prices. So pricing your vehicle fairly and publishing them as such, I think that's a great idea, because if you've done more research on the site, and if you go to a dealership, you're expected to know more about the market and the vehicle in general. So these are the high level recommendations that I can suggest.
Okay, thanks, Baris. I'd really like to thank you today for joining us on the podcast, sharing those insights. I'm sure dealers will be taking notes and really trying to operationalize some of those findings, because they love data and they love to know what consumers are up to. And thanks to TRADER Corporation as well for sponsoring the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Of course, my pleasure.
Okay, and I'm Todd Phillips signing off for another edition of TADA Talks.